All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? This show, of course, has never really cared about nostalgia or looking back into the past or really admiring anything about art that was made maybe prior to like 6 months ago. Of course, we are a
No,
Marvel
this is
boy.
year zero.
Exactly. We only talk about Marvel movies. We're big Marvel stans. We think that Deadpool is just the coolest. And we don't even want to watch the old Deadpool movies. We want to watch the most recent, whatever the fuck Ryan Reynolds Deadpool is doing. You know what I mean, Brian? That's
Well,
just the
I
kind of
think
podcast we are.
we've been pretty consistent on this. Culture, particularly popular American culture, is at its peak. It's basically improved so much in the last 20 years that there really is no reason to revisit anything from the past. And as time marches forward, the culture will get better and better, and we'll need less and less reason to go back more and more recently. I think that's a cornerstone of the show and really of the way that both you and I consume media and the way we live our lives.
Yes, 100%. But speaking of people who loved going back into the past, once again, not us at all, but people that love going back into the past and having nostalgia for the things of old, VH1 back in the 2000s with their I Love the series, starting with the I Love the 80s series. Were you aware of this, Brian?
I was extremely aware of this series. So this would have come out when I was, I guess, a late preteen, right? And this is like when I'm starting to develop what I guess you might call pop culture consciousness. Like I'm starting to read books about movies and I'm starting to branch out and watch weirder movies, starting to get into horror. Probably right on the cusp of me like getting into like Pink Floyd and the Beatles and diving off into like learning about rock music. I used to go visit my dad. I did not like going to see my dad a lot of the time because he had cable and I could watch the I Love series.
Yes, and that will be the subject of this week's episode. But before we get into our series of I Love the 80s, and to be fair, we're going to make many parts of I Love the series, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Week. Cringe generational of 2025.
Woo! Yeah! And Brian, this is my week. So, I looked through the I Love the 80s cast of like comedians
Like
and
the talking
actors and
heads.
talking heads, exactly. And I was just like, I really want to narrow down one. And I wouldn't say this is the most cringy individual out of all of them because obviously hundreds of people were interviewed for this series. But I do want to talk
Ron
about one in
Jeremy.
particular. Well, he was cringy in a different way, but I want to talk about the most relevant cringy individual related to my life that was covered on I Love the 80s, which was Dustin Diamond, otherwise known as Screech from Saved by the Bell. Are you aware of this individual, Brian? Because he was definitely on the I Love the series and VH1 in general.
Aware of Dustin Diamond, less from Saved by the Bell. That was just a little bit after my time, mostly because of shows like, the VH1 clip shows that all sprung forth from the I Love the 80s series, and because of the first or second season of The Surreal Life, on which he was prominently featured.
Yes, and also the weight loss one, too, the fitness one. But the reason I want to cover him, Brian, is because he spent the last years of his life about a half an hour away from me, and he had many adorable moments in his town, well, I shouldn't say hometown, but his final town of Port Washington, Wisconsin. And this one was from 2015. Saved by the Bell star Dustin Diamond sentenced to 4 months in jail for a stabbing incident at a bar.
I remember that. Like, I know it's a lot of things with, like, people who get into show business when they're real young, and there's fucked up sides to that, and there's lots of stuff you carry with you. But what was going on with him getting into bar fights? Do we have any details behind this?
Yes. So I found a CNN article, and it was, here we are, in 2015. Former child star Dustin Diamond was sentenced to 4 months in jail Thursday for stabbing a man during a Christmas Day bar fight in Wisconsin. Diamond, 38, who played the nerdy Screech in the 1990 sitcom Saved by the Bell, apologized for his actions on, quote, a night that centers around celebrating peace and love. Well, he certainly did that. That's for fucking sure.
But
He told the court,
he's in this bar on Christmas Day, which is like whatever, I guess. But like he wasn't in like a nice bar.
oh no. I mean, Port Washington is like a pretty ritzy, like, suburb, but still, yeah, it was probably the shittiest bar in that town would be my guess. I mean, I could be wrong
It
about
was
that,
the
but
one that would let Dustin Diamond come in.
yeah. He says, quote, I want to be clear that the situation will not be repeated again, calling the
Well, I should
fight
hope not.
the single most terrifying experience of my entire life. Well, you stabbed somebody, so I don't know how
Yeah.
terrifying it was for you.
It's funny to assault someone and be like, hey, this is a one-time thing. Like, well, yeah.
Judge Paul Malloy sentenced him to 120 days in jail and ordered him to pay more than $1,000 in restitution to send a message to the community that we're just not going to live like this. I wouldn't say that's much of a deterrent, to be honest with you. I mean?
Well, I mean, I agree. He did something bad. He probably, he needed to be punished. What do you mean we're not going to live like this? Like, there's roving Dustin Diamonds causing mayhem? What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. The very dangerous streets of Port Washington, Wisconsin, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you, Brian, I saw a wild, like, 80s bully brawl outside of the site where they're going to do that data center. I was very concerned. I was like, this is really scary.
It's a good thing Dustin Diamond wasn't there for that because you know how Screech was a target of bullies. They would have just sussed him right out.
That is very fucking true. So the lead up is that he claims that some guys were threatening his girlfriend at a bar and he pulled out a knife or whatever, but who the fuck knows? I mean, at the end of the day, if you lose a fight to Screech, you absolutely deserve to lose everything. I'm sorry. If you lose a fight to Screech, you are the world's biggest loser and you should just commit seppuku immediately.
As an isolated incident, right? You're like, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. Completely possible that someone was crossed a line, said something to his girlfriend, and he was, maybe reacted, not in the best way, but you're like, okay, I could see that. But everything we know about Mr. Diamond is that he's kind of a sleazeball, kind of a nasty, two-faced guy. And of course, I've never met the man. But Taylor, do you want to give us a little greatest hits of things that we know about Dustin Diamond post Screech?
Yes, he was one of the VH1, gadflies, for lack of a better word, because, of course, Screech was the peak of his career, and he never really had a career after that, so, of course, he had to be on nostalgia VH1 programs. Well, he got a sex tape that got leaked, too.
I learned about the sex tape because as a kid, I watched The Surreal Life. He was on The Surreal Life, I think, in the year following, like very shortly after the sex tape leaked. I've never seen it, because why would I? I think it's pretty gross. I think there's, like, scat stuff in it, but what I remember about, which, like, I don't care what people do or whatever, but my memory is that Dustin Diamond for many years after would kind of play both sides. He would on one hand say this is such an invasion of my privacy, this was really traumatic for my wife because he was married at the time, and obviously there's women who are not his wife on the tape, as is my understanding, and he kind of did a media tour going like this is out of control, this is out of line, which by the way, if your sex tape is leaked, that is out of line. I'm not disputing that. But Diamond also, in the years immediately following this leaked sex tape, became like a guy that went to porn conventions and like distributed his own tape and signed it. And I'm of two minds about this because I guess maybe it's already leaked. You're like, well, at least now I have control of it, right? But it's also like if you're saying all this stuff about how like, well, he would give these spiels on this real life about how like I don't want people to talk about it. I don't want anyone to know about it. This is really traumatic for me. Well, literally at the same time, going and distributing it at porn conventions. The other side of this is that in more recent years, I believe Dustin Diamond claimed that he does not appear in the sex scenes. I have no idea, again, if any of this is true, but what he claimed later in life is that he made the sex tape specifically to ride the coattails of the Paris Hilton sex tape. Like, he saw the bump it gave her and was like, well, this will be good for me. And then he hired some people to be in a sex tape. He claims perform in the sex tape. It's another person he hired. What he says is that there was video editing to make it look like it's him having sex. Not sure what to make of any of this, but I will say, for other reasons, Dustin Diamond does not seem like the most trustworthy guy.
No, absolutely not. But, speaking of people who aren't trustworthy, Brian, and their tales of old and their regaling of tales, let's get into the I Love the 80s series. Now, of course, we talked about we were both obsessed with this show in and around when it came out. I was probably aware of it maybe teenage years, so like 2005, 2006. And yeah, I remember we were talking about this on Messenger and stuff like that, and how in not necessarily pre-internet, because you were kind of an early internet kid, but for me, like, this was a way to like find out about a lot of like pop culture stuff that I wouldn't have really known about outside of like cable television nostalgia content.
Definitely. So I was kind of an early internet kid, but we didn't always have the internet, right? So we did go through periods where we had the internet, and then we'd go through these periods when I was young, especially around this period when I'm initially watching them. We would then not have the internet. We wouldn't be able to afford it or something. This was kind of my exposure to a lot of things. In fact, I was thinking about it this week. You could argue that the thing that's led to us doing this podcast now is kind of VH1 I Love series, because it's kind of, for me, it was the first thing where I was like, oh, I can be really nerdy about these, at the time, seemingly minute pop culture things. Like, at the time, really, this series seemed like a wealth of knowledge and trivia, and it was exposing me to movies and music and toys and fashion, and I was just like, wow, this is so cool. There's all this stuff that I don't know that I'm learning about. Watching it now, you're like, oh boy, this is really a facile introduction to these things. But yeah, again, like, pretty much pre-internet, internet. You didn't always have access to that information, you know?
No, absolutely. And that's why I think, yeah, even though I did watch a couple clips and I actually saw I can't remember, it was one of those like YouTube, like commentary channel guys go over it. And yeah, some of it obviously didn't age very well. I mean, it's something that came out in the early 2000s. But, either way, absolutely, this thing was for sure a gateway into a lot of the stuff that like I was not familiar with at the time of being, like I said, like a very young teenager. Like, of course, and we're not going to go over all the things that were covered in the I Love the 80s series, because that would take like 5 hours. But, stuff like I remember I first really heard about the Friday the 13th movies from this. You know what I mean? Like, I heard about legendary songs that weren't played in heavy rotation at that point anymore, from everything from like, fucking Queen to Prince to, even Michael Jackson, who I was just vaguely familiar with at the time. You know what I'm saying? Like, TMNT, of course, too, and Guns N' Roses, and, U2. And like, to be fair, I'm not a big fan of all those things, but, they're very good gateway media to get into other things.
I think one of the first times when I have a recollection of like when I really like learned about the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, which seems so silly now, was in an I Love the 70s little 5-minute clip or something about them. That's not for a few years, a few years after seeing these, like those types of bands became my life. They became a big part of still to this day what I kind of model my hobbies and my kind of friendships around. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I think I saw clips of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I was vaguely aware of as kind of a movie nerd kid because my mom likes some cool movies, but actual clips from the film for the first time on I Love the 70s. And like hearing new wave songs. I'm sure the first time I heard like pop music was on I Love the 80s. And I was just like, what is this? This weird futuristic sound.
Yeah, exactly. It's like retrofuturism. And you're just like, wait, this came out like 20 years ago? This is like wild. You know what I mean? It's very interesting.
At the time, Taylor, we're talking about now, you watch it as a kid and you feel like it's almost like secret knowledge is being bestowed upon you by the pop culture gods. Like that's how it felt when I was like 10 years old. Now I watch it and I'm like, oh, it's a bunch of dorks talking about stuff that they don't really know a lot about. But at the time, it felt like it was like I was being granted access to all this hip information that I could then, if anything seemed really interesting, I'd go to my school library or I'd go to the local library and I'd suss it out. Watching it now, it's like a nostalgic thing in and of itself. Me going back to like, oh, do you remembering the feeling of learning about fucking Tron for the first time? It's kind of the nostalgia's become, it's like meta nostalgia in a really weird way. Yeah, like I said, it's weird watching now because even though this came out post 9/11, it's big end of history vibes. It's VH1 pop culture. It's clearly not meant to be politically serious. They don't try to be, but there's a default to kind of a relaxed liberalism in just kind of the historical perspective. There is sort of an idea of like, do you remember when we had this past of like Cold War conflict and all this culture coming out? Now everything is like stabilized, right? And now we know what culture is. That is kind of, I think unconsciously the kind of intermittent tone of the series.
Yes, and on top of it too, I know obviously we'll cover it in a future episode, but the I Love the 90s and the subsequent series got actually way more, and saying this is just so trite, but they did get more political in the fact they actually covered more political events, whereas I Love the 80s was basically just pop culture. I mean, they covered like some stuff, obviously. Like they covered Ronald Reagan's assassination in one episode, and I think they covered like the Soviet Union collapsing a little bit. Yeah, stuff like that. But the 90s, definitely, they covered a lot more. Like, I remember they covered like the Oklahoma City bombing at one point. That was the first time I ever heard of that. I'm pretty sure it was from I Love the 90s. Columbine, of course, yep, too. And, I think that's interesting, right, is that obviously, and like I said, we'll very much review that series later on, right? But with the I Love the 90s, like the 90s in general were a much more pessimistic decade in a lot of ways than the 80s were. Like the 80s were kind of riding the high of like Reaganomics and trickle-down economics and the wealth of the top 1% just exploding and obviously to where we're fucking at now, where like 5 people own like 90% of the country's wealth or whatever the fuck. But that was like a time of just like severe excess. And then the 90s were like just sort of like, well, our big enemy's over, so like what the fuck else are we gonna do, I guess. And some people got pessimistic and some people got very optimistic, but I think the change in the tone of I Love the 90s was a lot different than the 80s, because the 80s was definitely a little bit more colorful and the 90s was a little bit more dour, at least from the pop culture at the time that I am familiar with.
Absolutely. The specific entry, that we're talking about here, the I Love series, is the first one. It's I Love the 80s. There are numerous spin-offs and variations on it, but what you see throughout here, right, and I think this is a key part of nostalgia, I don't think it's necessarily good or bad. It's like a wistfulness, right? It's the idea that like culture has moved on, and whether you think culture has moved on, there are writers that describe the feeling of nostalgia as like a hauntingness. And the thing is that this series is supposed to not be that. It's very joyous, right? It's the idea of like there are all these cool, fun things and you can relive them now, but you kind of still see it crop up throughout. Depending depending on who the talking head is. But there is sort of this lingering sense, at least to me, and I think I felt this way in sort of an abstract way as a kid watching this. Why does everything in the 70s and 80s look so cool, look so colorful, look so like alive? And everything else on VH1, why does a lot of it suck? And part of that's because we remember the best things from past eras. So part of it's just that. But it definitely in part has to do with like cultural shifts. Again, like you said, the 80s is like a futuristic decade. There's this feeling of like we're transitioning into this almost kind of utopian like market future. And it turns out that is not what happened in the next 20 years, 30 years.
That is definitely not the way that the future went. I don't know if fortunately or unfortunately is quite the right word, but it definitely did not go that way, that's for sure. And, you know, talking about some of the subject matter, right, I was also obviously introduced to some of the talking heads on here who, you know, you still see a lot of them on media and being like talking heads and comedians and actors even to this day. So I was introduced to a lot of those fucking people. Like, I'm pretty sure that was the first time I saw fucking Dave Mustaine was on I Love the 80s, you know what I mean?
So there are a few people who kind of became like C-list and D-list celebrities, specifically known for like pop culture commentary because of these shows. Specifically, people like Michael Ian Black, who I kind of throughout my teens and into my early 20s was a very big fan of his writing and his stand-up comedy. People like Mo Rocca, who I think shortly after this series began airing, he transitioned, he left The Daily Show, and is still, I think today, is a writer for Good Morning America. He does like pop culture segments for them. I don't know what Hal Sparks does these days, but for a few years, Hal Sparks was like, these were kind of like lowbrow pop culture, like kind of theorists, right? Michael Ian Black was almost kind of like a dumb guy's Mark Fisher.
Yeah, and you know, on top of it, I mean, Hal Sparks, I would say pretty inarguably got his fucking cameo on Spider-Man 2 because of this series. He was, I would say, with Michael Ian Black, probably the two most prominent talking heads out of the entire I Love the series. Like, those two guys were in, like, every fucking episode and for every series of it. It's crazy.
For every segment, yeah. One thing that I notice watching these now is sometimes it seems to me like the talking heads, specifically people like Mo Rocca, Hal Sparks, Michael Ian Black, the really popular kind of Gen X comedy guys, sometimes it seems as I watch it now like maybe they're being sarcastic about some of the subjects, and the show does not want us to think they're being sarcastic. There's a lot of moments where they'll be talking about some song or some movie or something, and Michael Ian Black, they'll just show him saying, yeah, it was great, I loved it. And then they'll cut away, and it's like, I think he was like taking the piss a little bit in that moment, and they edited it in such a way that they can look sincere.
Yeah, especially with the way that Michael Ian Black's like style is, like deadpan, sort of, yeah, very just bleakly ironic.
Very Gen X.
Very Gen X, yeah, very Gen X comedian. And the one time I ever was aware of him being earnest was when he got into a fight with fucking John McCain's daughter during their like book tour. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. Michael Ian Black turned out to be kind of an annoying, left-leaning lib, He's a pretty good writer. He had his moment. Probably my biggest lifelong takeaway from this series is learning about Michael Ian Black as like a writer. That book he did with Meghan McCain was fucking embarrassing.
I mean, to be fair, why the fuck would you want to hang out with John McCain's daughter? I guess unless you're trying to bang her, I guess. I mean, even then, that sounds like a pretty miserable experience. I hate to say it. I mean, everybody's got their own thing. I don't get the appeal of Meghan McCain at all from a look standpoint, and obviously from a temperamental standpoint, she is an awful human being. But, some of the other people on here, like, of course, Ron Jeremy, the guy who I would say respected consent the most out of anybody ever. He was the first cinematic portrayal of Super Mario. By the way, that is a subject that we will never cover, obviously, because we don't want to fucking get banned off YouTube. But the Super Hornio Brother movies are fucking dog shit. Have you seen them?
I think they're good.
And to be fair, obviously, I didn't watch the whole thing because, of course, if I want to watch smut, I'd rather just watch smut that's not bad.
Yeah, but just watch it.
I remember the Cinema Snob covered it when I still liked the Cinema Snob, and I'm like, this looks really bad. Even by porn standards, this is really bad.
I just looked it up. This looks awful.
Nintendo owns the copyright to the porno, which is hilarious, too.
Good for them.
For a fact that
they... Jeremy ever play Gaddafi? Like, do a porn parody of Gaddafi?
I don't think so. That doesn't strike me as something he would do. I'm not saying like he's too good for it, but though. I don't know. I mean, obviously an incredibly unattractive person and obviously incredibly unattractive like personality on top.
A dark soul and an ugly face.
Like, I'm sorry, like, obviously you shouldn't assume people's personalities and intentions by the way they look, but Ron Jeremy, yeah, I imagine that's the type of guy Ron Jeremy would look like.
Well, that's a thing that Roald Dahl talks about in one of his children's books is evil thoughts breed evil looks, and so when you see a very ugly person, just remember when you judge them, it's because they're full of ugly thoughts that made them that way. In retrospect, crazy about this very silly series, which, as much as we're saying now when we were kids, it was this kind of wealth of knowledge, right? It introduced us all these things. Watching it now, I mean, a lot of these segments are like 90 seconds long. Watching it now, you're like, well, you barely talked about it at all, which is perfect for the American attention span, which is part of why this took off, I think. There is no way VH1 could have expected the kind of runaway success they had with this series, because for about 10 years after, this format, this clip show faux documentary approach, it defined what VH1 did. They did them for the 70s and the 90s. They've attempted twice to do them with the 2000s. They did the awesomely bad music videos, or awesomely bad songs series, if you remember that, which was just clip shows about metal and pop songs from the 70s and 80s and 90s. A lot of the same contributors. They did a lot of music ones, of course, because it's VH1 and they began as a music channel. Their top 100 hard rock artists, all their top 100, bottom 100, top 20 slashers, which is a series they did one Halloween. But all of that is just them seeing how easy it is, how popular the clip show format is. Just get some celebrities who people may or may not know. You have them say some witty or not so witty things, or insightful or not so insightful things to the camera, and then you show some fucking footage from merchandise that Ted Turner already owns, will be free for VH1 to license. And people like me who just want to learn about pop culture and are kind of white trash will just plug in and just, feel like we're being read from the scrolls.
No, absolutely. And you're totally right about obviously the runaway success of the I Love the 80s series, which obviously, like you said, transformed into other series. But in a lot of ways, and obviously this didn't start the 80s nostalgia train because, of course, that was just going to happen regardless. But these guys were very much ahead of the curve on the 80s nostalgia train. Like, can you really think of a lot of things that were 80s nostalgia before this series came out? I can't.
Well, so the first thing I was thinking about this recently, this week, I think the beginning of 80s nostalgia, the first thing I saw it on growing up was in the video game kind of online community, right? I think it happened a little faster there because the 80s were like the cultural peak until recently of video games. But as far as like the bigger 80s nostalgia for synth pop, the nostalgia for like 16 millimeter film, I do think, like you said, it wasn't caused by the I Love the 80s series, but they kind of predicted it. They were kind of in a perfect place because as the show was airing, it had been on for a couple years, that starts popping off. I don't know if this was a thing that, any of our listeners, or Taylor, if you have familiarity with, the toy collector community got big into 80s nostalgia just a few years after this. And I think this is when you start seeing acts like the Killers pop off, who I think kind of suck. But their whole thing is that if you missed out on 80s new romantic music because you were a millennial, then you could listen to the Killers and feel like you were part of it, right? And yeah, I think this is one of the first examples of it.
Yeah, like, and talk about the video game stuff specifically, like, obviously there were collections of retro games that came out in the 70s and 80s that were released on, like, the PS1 or, like, very early PS2 or whatever, so you're totally right. And, the toy collecting community just goes back to, like, old toys just because that's
Yeah, you want the stuff that you were into when you grew up with.
So, stuff like music trends, though, like, you're totally right. Yeah, the new romantic stuff, synth pop, like, revival, stuff like butt rock revival, or butt rock in general, which was obviously a ripoff of, like, grunge and stuff like that, but, of course, wants to think it stylistically is derived from, like, fucking hair metal and stuff from the 80s and stuff like that. So, and usually music trends, even though I wouldn't say they're last to the punch of nostalgia, like it's a bad thing, but they tend to be some of the last media trends that come about due to nostalgia, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like, there are movies that parodied 80s movies, like in 2001, like Not Another Teen Movie came out in like 2002 or whatever the fuck. The Killers became big in like 2005 or 2006. That was like quite a few years after that.
The thing with the 80s nostalgia when you look at the 2000s is I think it's still recent enough that a large portion of young people in the early 2000s have a first-hand memory of some of that stuff, right? So that's kind of what makes that appealing in that particular time. That's how nostalgia works. That's why it happens in 20-year cycles typically. But when you get to 80s nostalgia now, because it's so much longer, it's still a thing. Like, you still have artists that are quite popular. In fact, actually in pop music, when you look at current things by artists like Sabrina Carpenter or The Weeknd, there's kind of retro 80s nostalgia. There's a lot of that in horror movies coming out. But now it's a little more mythic, right? Like when you watch something like the I Love series, it's more like, oh boy, we all remember this cool thing. Do you remember this cool thing? Whereas when The Weeknd does 80s nostalgia on like the Dawn FM album. It's more like an 80s that he knows never existed. It's this weird kind of Blade Runner, kind of dark utopia of 80s, where he's like, oh, the 80s when everyone was listening to, synth pop and reading J.G. Ballard, and it has less to do with being there. The appeal of the I Love series, at least ostensibly, is that these are a bunch of cool adults saying, boy, I remember when this cool stuff was coming out. I'm curious if you agree. Watching this as a kid who didn't live through these things, I remember feeling like I remember them all, because it allows you to be in on the joke, to be like, yeah, I remember He-Man. I didn't remember He-Man. That was like what my older brother played with. I didn't remember when Atari came out, but a show like this allowed you to kind of have some fleeting impression that you're like, yeah, I'm hip to this thing that's part of our great cultural history.
No, absolutely. And the 2000s and very early 2010s were also the era of the reboots of various 80s cartoons, which, talk about a very 80s thing, right? The reason that cartoons were so big in the 80s was that Ronald Reagan deregulated the children's advertising regulations that allowed basically mascots to advertise everything from food to snacks to like candy to everything. And that's also helped blow up our obesity rates. That's the thing, America.
Yeah.
If you ever want to blame somebody, always blame Reagan. Reagan is almost always why America sucks right now.
Truly.
The most 80s president. The most 80s president.
No, he was. There could be no other president for the 1980s. No, the post-Vietnam era, Nixon fucking around, and there's this brief moment of like, pseudo accountability. Ford, I think he's kind of a placeholder, fuck around. The post-Vietnam president, in that brief moment where we're sharing this deep shame and guilt of Vietnam, it's Carter. And he's one term. We've paid our sins. We're launching forward. Reagan makes us feel good. He's going to be in the future. He is the DeLorean president.
Yes, absolutely. And, Back to the Future. There's no other era that movie series really could have came out other than the 80s. Like, let's be honest here, debuted.
Because you have to have this moment for something like Back to the Future. You have to have this moment where the boomers are coming of age. They have a level of self-awareness because they went through like the 60s. They went through the civil rights. They went through the rock and roll thing. So they've got some self-awareness about where the culture's at. But they've also got some distance from that counterculture. And they can look back on the 50s and go, boy, that was swell. And now we're middle class and we have families. And it's kind of circular. And there's enough of a thing where they're like, oh, but I'd hate for things to get worse. Boy, the 50s were swell and the rock and roll was young and I felt so alive. But also, boy, if we do things wrong in the 80s, I'd hate for things to become some horrible corporate dystopia, even though all the choices I'm making now in my current life are going to make it that. Those are the only people that could have made Back to the Future. And that's why the same person that made Back to the Future made Forrest Gump. Because these are the feelings that were hanging around his weird baby boomer brain at that time.
Yes, and don't forget that the main bad guy of the Back to the Future series in part 2 was directly based on Donald Trump, the guy who became president 30 years later. That's when you know America's great.
It feels almost trite to say, but it's worth repeating. When people say, we're on the worst timeline, like it's, you can roll your eyes at it, it's cringe, it's soy, it's dirty, but like, this is not, regardless of what the people in your life who might call themselves mega say, this is not the future that anyone has ever wanted. The future that we are saddled with, it was never an impossible future. It was always in the cards. But this is not what anyone was asking for. And a lot of things had to go wrong. And a lot of people had to fuck up both intentionally and accidentally for us to get here. And we got here.
No, absolutely. And, speaking of going to the worst timeline, I do want to talk a little bit about, how the series of I Love the 80s started off with, obviously like 1980 specifically during Jimmy Carter's last year in the 1980 election, all the way until the very end, because the beginning of the 80s and the end of it was really stark. The cultural shift was pretty fucking wild. Like it went from, obviously you talked about the very early synthwave, synth pop stuff to, very much, even going back to the main two superpowers of the time, which was the Soviet Union and the United States, and having the Soviet Union very much in its sort of nadir era, and then ending with Gorbachev just like fucking selling the country for parts pretty much at the end of the 80s is really wild to think about, right? It went from America and the Soviet Union being almost equal, but definitely one doing a little bit better, to like one superpower just completely non-existent by the end of it.
Well, I mean, if you talk to people who are alive at the 80s, it doesn't seem like, if you talk to someone in America in 1985 and said, oh, do you think the Cold War's almost over? They would say no. Probably if you talk to someone in the Soviet Union in 1985 and said, do you think the Cold War's almost over? They would say no. I'm not even sure if the Soviet officials, some of whom, like you said, were accidentally complicit, some of them absolutely intentionally, I don't think that anyone knew at the time that that was the shift that was going to happen. but you see it reflected in the culture in an interesting way, especially in a way that's relevant to I Love the 80s. And of course, VH1 would never talk about this. First of all, this is barely post 9/11, very end of history tone to the show. But one of the things you see throughout the 80s pop culture is the beginning of the decade, you get this kind of alternative, futurist thing that's fairly mainstream in like new wave and some punk rock. Definitely the shadow of the Cold War looms over that. But by the mid 80s, that even sort of transforms into this very like yuppie friendly version of new wave, right? With like Duran Duran, with like ABC. I love these bands. I'm not saying that these are bad bands, but it's like this yuppie evolution of new wave that like it's like the genre evolved to meet the Reagan moment. Because Devo is not that. Duran Duran is. Duran Duran is doing this Brian Ferry kind of a feat, like class-driven idea of like dancing and partying, and like we're kind of quirked up and we're alternative and we're very classy. And you see that even I think to a degree in like metal music. You see what starts in 1980, you've got like the new wave of British heavy metal, right? You've got Iron Maiden, you've got Priest, and Ozzy Osbourne's broken out solo. That sort of evolves into this thing that we now call hair metal, which is kind of a derisive term and sometimes kind of unfair, but it's sort of like heavy metal had to become less grungy and it had to meet the moment. It had to like meet Reaganomics, right? And I'm not saying any of these bands were thinking about this, but it's just sort of the way the culture moved.
Yes, and you know, as you mentioned, like Devo and the Duran Duran difference, like Devo ostensibly started from the late '60s counterculture, like hippie
Can't say
anti-war
it.
movement, exactly, and Duran Duran came from the excessive '80s. So it's wild to think about that those two bands, who ostensibly once again came from the same like subgenre of music, but had two wildly different like stylistic and like aesthetic and even like ideology origins. It's wild to think about. Well, Devo as a band name comes from the concept of de-evolution, which I believe the guy whose friends died at Kent State came up with as a sort of like, we're
Bob
really
Casale.
dying as a culture.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, Bob Casale was Chapo Trap House. Of course, they're very successful businessmen and artists now, but their politics are pretty, like now they're probably more like left liberals, but they're firmly on the left in the late 70s, early 80s. One of the, I say, weaknesses of the I Love series that we're talking about and the general VH1 clip show pop culture thing, but that's maybe not fair. Let's say I go up to someone, let's say I could transport myself at 33 years old, which I am right now, onto the set of I Love the 80s, and I could go up to Greg Fitzsimmons, and I could say, tell me about Devo and Duran Duran. Now, maybe Greg Fitzsimmons knows a lot about those artists and can give me a lot of information about their discographies or whatever, but more likely than not, he's going to say, oh, Devo, Duran Duran, they're both new wave bands. They're basically the same thing. And then he'll say something funny about the plastic clothes or, you know, androgyny or something. And then I might be left with the idea that, well, this guy was alive in the 80s. He's an expert on new wave. And clearly, you know, new wave is this gaudy 80s thing, and Devo and Duran Duran are the same thing. I could go up to, like, say the Grounded for Life guy and say, tell me about Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. And he'd say, well, you know, they both came out in the 80s and they both involve horny teenagers being mutilated. It's really rad. And then, you know, as a kid, you might go like, well, I guess that's what those movies are. Now, I know this seems really fucking autistic of me. Watching these now, it's incredibly frustrating. Kind of just the flattening of culture like this. And that's what these shows are for. It makes pop culture into these bite-sized little chunks that anyone, from like a weird kid like us who just wants to learn more about movies and video games and whatever, to like just your uncle who was alive at the time who's got it on as background noise, can just eat it up like a bite-sized piece of candy and go, I remember Pac-Man. I remember fucking Belinda Carlisle and her hair. I remember how hot Belinda Carlisle was when she was in the Go-Go's. That's fun. I've had a lot of fun watching the I Love series this week as someone who watched them as a kid, but as information, as like pop culture analysis and journalism, it is like the worst thing, especially now that we live in the internet age. Like, I couldn't recommend it to a young person now. If a younger person said, I want to learn about pop culture in the 80s, I would not say, oh, watch I Love the 80s by VH1.
No, absolutely 100%. And you know, I was talking about obviously the commentary YouTuber that was covering this series for just like, it was like a 20-minute video or something. But like in a lot of ways, this is also the precursor to, as we've mentioned on many shows, the nostalgia, commentary, etc. genre of YouTube content that we see today.
Yeah.
Like, remember that fucking old ass movie? But now obviously they go into far more depth with it, but it's basically the same thing. But I don't know if that content of internet content would exist without stuff like I Love the 80s, or at least stuff like it.
So I'm being completely sincere when I say because of the age I was at when I saw this show, and I was so into it when I was a little kid, and because of like how impressionable I was and how desperate I was to learn about pop culture. This is one of the things that this led to me learning more about old video games. It led to me wanting to learn about like punk rock and other like weird rock music and early hip hop. All these movies that some of these movies I would have heard about because my parents were both had watched a lot of movies. Some of them I never would have heard about, and I just remembered them for years, and then I would have them logged in my head as this movie that existed until I could finally see them. Like there might not be as many pop culture analysis podcasts by millennials like this one if not for this show, because it gave you, I mean, I'm talking shit about kind of how facile and shallow the analysis is, but that wasn't really the point, right? For a lot of us at the time, we still didn't have internet, or like me, you had internet very inconsistently, and the internet wasn't this really refined research machine like it is now, at least not to a layperson like myself at the age. This was a thing that could expose you to all this stuff. That's what it was to me, like having these shows on VH1, and then all the clip shows that came after, which again would also annoy me now, like top 100 hard rock artists or whatever, or like top 50 sneakers was, I know, a VH1 clip show I saw as a kid. Watching these now, I'd be very frustrated. But at the time, it was like, here's a bunch of cool shit that you've never heard of. And I remembered it for years. Like, that's what these are. Or that's what these were at the time. And for people older than me, they were like a fun jaunt down memory lane. For me, though, 10, 12 years old, I think they were pretty indispensable. I'd go to my dad's and I'd watch this show. VH1 used to show these all day long. They'd show every year in a row, and then they'd start back over at 1980, right? My dad'd be at work, so I'd visiting my dad, but spending a lot of time alone at his house where he had cable. This is like, oh, I have a bunch of weird, cool, older friends to talk about pop culture with, and they're teaching me about the Jay Giles band or whatever fucking thing,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, especially as, like I said, I didn't have internet really growing up, so it was cable. And, I was a latchkey kid, which I don't know if that was ever discussed on the show, but my mom would work like fucking 12 hours a day. So I'd get home from school, get something to eat, and then just turn on VH1 or Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon or whatever, and just go basically down memory lane a lot of the time, or, watch anime or Toonami or whatever the fuck was on. But at the same time, like, this was part of my background rotation of content along with, like, cartoons. And also, by the way, I used to watch the news regularly in the morning, too. I was a weird...
That's so Taylor. That's so fucking Taylor. No, I think the I Love series, the VH1 clip show thing, those came out, or I started watching them in my later preteens, kind of transitioning into puberty. And I think that's kind of, like, I transitioned away from watching cartoons all the time to watching these, like, pop culture retrospectives. And then, I'm kind of getting to that age where I'm starting to, around that time or a little bit later, I want to get more into movies, and I want to learn more about rock music and things. But these kind of came out at just the right time for that, right? And I think the thing with a lot of kids like us, Taylor, who were spent a lot of time online once we had the internet, is this almost gave you sort of like a jumping off point, right? Because I remember a few years later, in the mid 2000s, I got a Something Awful account. And I didn't think about this at the time, but in retrospect, thinking about this series, the I Love series, and my relationship with it, this almost is sort of like, it's like we're being snarky shit, and wasn't that weird, but also we kind of like it. That was basically when I got on Something Awful. That's what it was, right? You were trying really hard to have witty opinions about all this old pop culture that other people knew about with you. And this sort of was kind of a jumping off point for me in that, I guess I'm still doing that now because we do it every week on this show.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, speaking of, I think those are my really final thoughts on this is that, as, you mentioned earlier, that obviously you would never recommend this to like a 13-year-old kid who's trying to learn about fucking nostalgic pop culture now. But at the time, this was a pretty, I would say, revolutionary concept for like teenage you and me in like the mid 2000s or early 2000s or whatever.
For a very particular type of kid.
No, absolutely. And, once again, I learned about, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street from this. And then, I would go to the local used video store, which, of course, where I was at was Mega Media Exchange. And, of course, when you moved to Green Bay, it was Mega Media Exchange, too. But I remember just going up and down the aisle and seeing, Friday the 13th. And I'm like, ooh, I like this. What is similar to this? And I just go down the aisles and just find, like, fucking DVD covers that had similar covers. And I'm like, ooh, let me get this for, like, $2. And then I'd be like, oh, that's wild. And then I'd keep going down and down and getting more and more obscure. And that's where I got most of my, like, horror movie knowledge was from stuff like I Love the 80s. And it's the tip of the iceberg going down to the most submerged part of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's the same thing I was thinking. I rewatched, we're talking about the I Love the 80s, but I watched some I Love the 70s, which was the first series that I watched. And that was my favorite, right? I think like, yeah, I think that's the first time I like heard Johnny Rotten sing. And I remember thinking as a kid, boy, that guy sounds insane, which is such a funny thing to say now because he's so quaint, you know. But I knew about death metal singers and new metal singers, and I knew they growled and whatever. But, you know, I remember distinctly thinking, well, he's not singing like a metal singer. He's like doing something else, which the way Johnny Rotten sings became kind of a key part of like my life for a few years there. But I think my first thing of like seeing the Sex Pistols and going, those guys look crazy. I didn't know they had guys like that in the 70s was from this silly VH1 series. But again, the culture's changed so much. Whatever value there is to watching this now, it's for millennials who watched it at the time to look back at it as like a time capsule, which is, you know, what I've been doing this week and I'm having fun doing. And, you know, you still see some fun footage and you hear some fun snarky jokes about goofy pop culture. But again, you would never recommend this to a young person who was precocious and wanted to learn about movies or music. There's so many better, more dignified resources for that now.
No, absolutely. But yeah, this is very much a time capsule. And like I said, we will very much get into some of the sequel series here. I mean, we're not going to go over like top 50 sneakers or whatever the fuck, but we will absolutely cover like I love the 90s and I love the 70s at the very least.
We have to.
No, absolutely. But either way, just like New Year's Eve 1989, I think that ends our retrospective on I Love the 80s. So let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe and follow us on both of our YouTube and our Spotify channels where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. You know, of course, their good friends Scott, Shaw, and Robert are literally right now filming their series as of recording. And we just want them to have more moral and financial support to continue to get even more episodes and series off the ground for this. And Brian, do you have any updates from filming that you're aware of?
Well, Scott keeps in touch with us. They're making the series. There are updates, unspecific updates that I think they're doing a lot right now. They're making a lot of progress. The series is being made. I don't want to say anything else without Scott here, but like it's rolling. It's happening now. That's not to say don't donate. Please do. They need all the support they can get. They need monetary support. They need morale support.
Maybe even spiritual support.
Yeah, spiritual support. But it's happening. Actually, Scott is sending us pretty regularly just little updates. It's moving along quickly. And, you know, I always like to point out when we do this segment, this is an ambitious premise. Like, this is a high concept show. That's why we are so eager to support them, because they're independent artists that they're trying to do something fairly big here. And I don't know if it's something with a lot of precedent in, you know, their sort of religious media sphere. Pretty sure they're trying something that's, kind of unprecedented.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very ambitious. We're very excited to see it. And, you know, as we've always said, if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, just, you know, send us proof that you donated, and we will, within reason, match those donations, because we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to continue to become a reality. I mean, of course, they're already becoming a reality, but we want it to even be more of a reality.
Yeah, they've been great friends to us. We want them to be able to realize their ambitions as fully and in a way that they are fully satisfied with, or as close to as possible. Because I know, just from talking to Scott, he very much has like the Dan Aykroyd writer thing of he has these big ideas, you know. You're kind of like, how are you going to pull this off? And we want to see how they manage to do it.
No, absolutely. We're very excited to see that. And, you know, speaking of things we're very excited to see, and hopefully it falls apart for the bad guy side on this. You know, of course, we've been talking about the Luigi Mangione trial and or I should say the up-and-coming Luigi Mangione trials and Luigi Mangione Defense Fund. You know, last time I'd heard, Luigi is refusing to appear in Pennsylvania court via remote access. And here's the thing, right? Why would you want to appear at this trial that literally the vast majority of physical evidence would have to be thrown out in the first place? It's just a fucking waste of time. Why are they even bothering?
Yeah, what's the fucking point?
Case?
Yeah.
Like, they didn't Mirandize it for 17 minutes, and they got the vast majority of the physical evidence from the first 17 minutes. What is there even a trial to be had for? Absolute fucking show trial nonsense. But, you know, either way, we want to help Luigi Mangione as best we can, because, of course, we obviously believe from all the evidence presented to us that he's absolutely innocent, not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Like, if this trial was literally held today, he would be found not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by any reasonable jury. There is just nothing connecting him to the assassination of Brian Thompson. And they absolutely fucking notice. We've always said on the show, basically every episode we give a new update on judicial and prosecutorial misconduct that has happened in these various cases. It is that frequent that they're trying to fuck this guy over and being used as a pawn for the Trump administration's political goals at this point.
Yeah, they're making an example of him. They're upset by the level of solidarity we as the masses have shown him, and they want to make an example of him and show that they don't care the kind of support that we'll give each other. It's not going to be enough. That's what they want to say to all of us.
Exactly. So we need to give a big middle motherfucking finger. And if that middle finger includes financial, incentives and, financial donations to the campaign, I should say, then feel free to, of course, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, just send us proof that you donated, and we will, of course, within reason, match those donations because we want Luigi to have the best possible trial. And at this moment, he's set up pretty heavily for success, but we just need to keep going. And of course, if you can't donate to him, just post positively on the internet about him, send him a letter, as of course we've always said, or at the very least, just don't talk shit about him because we don't need more negativity in this right now. We're all in this together, and Luigi is just part of the masses that we need to stick up for. Seriously.
Yeah, like you said, if you look at this on paper, you look at all of the legal precedent, he is set up for success. But that's not to get comfy or to say that they're not going to fucking do everything in their power to fuck him over. Because I can tell you, the prosecution and the police that made the arrest, I'm sure they are just fucking seething that all of this is still going on. That we haven't forgotten Luigi like they wanted us to.
Exactly. So once again, we support Luigi on that. And, speaking of people you should absolutely support just as much as Luigi Mangione, ideally more financially than him, we have a Patreon page. Now, last time I checked, I haven't updated in a while, but last time I checked, we don't have any patrons, but please become our first patron of the day. We have plenty of tiers, including 2 of them that are directly talking about donating to the causes that we just mentioned. But of course, the one that I always plug is the $5 tier, where you get every episode 48 hours early. That's guaranteed 2 to 4 episodes a month. And you know what? As I always say, the first 48 hours are the most important. As we always talk about, I love the 80s, right? Imagine there's a new VH1 show about the best podcasts of the 2020s. And you're going to hear about all this information 20 years before everybody else hears about it. When Hal Sparks, when he's 79 years old, shitting in a piss pot, is talking about how cool millennials are old are, you'll get to hear about this shit first. Seriously, isn't that fucking cool?
You could be one of the talking heads on the Millennials Are Old segment of VH1's I Love the 2020s. You could be the Michael Ian Black of 2045.
Exactly. Who wouldn't want to be Michael Ian Black Jr.?
Yeah, he's so cool these days.
His Twitter is really good.
Oh, I haven't checked his Twitter in a long time. Boy, he was really eating shit for a while there. He was like having meltdowns about the DSA or something.
That sounds about right. Was he one of those like fucking annoying like Gen X liberals who's always like, I hate Netanyahu too, but Hamas is ISIS?
I don't know about that. I'm thinking more to like the 2010s. He might not be that bad, but he definitely was like, there's no chance of Bernie winning, so why even support him? It's a waste of time.
Yeah, he was a big Clinton guy for sure. And that was another one that wasn't an I Love the 80s thing, but it's a very like 2000s nostalgic thing for me. Adam Sessler having a meltdown about being pro-Israel was one of the most depressing things from like media gadflies post October 7th. I'm like, really? That guy is like a Zionist? God damn it. And like Adam Sessler is not somebody who I think should be like president or anything, but I'm like, really, dude, you're smarter than that. Shut the fuck up.
But that was such a default position for like anyone in public culture for so long, prior to the internet, really. Like, did the vast majority of Americans see anything coming out of Hamas? Like, no, that was just the default. That was the standard. Saying Israel is bad in this conflict for people his age would be, well, I guess it would be similar to saying that the Soviet Union was right. It would be crazy. It would be a crazy thing for them to hear because it was almost, for people that age in America, it's almost an apolitical statement because it's the reality that they've been brought up with unquestionably their whole life.
That's true. And on top of it, I know a lot of people on I Love the 80s have explicitly performed shows in Israel. I know that. I looked through many of them and I'm like, 10 of those people directly played in Israel. Did you ever listen to Henry Rollins stand up from Israel? I haven't, and I don't want to.
I have. It's a fucking bummer. It's a fucking drag. I fucking hate it.
And people say the Riyadh Comedy Festival is bad and looks bad.
Since this is an episode about nostalgia, it seems appropriate to lean back on the old adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, all that stupid shit people love to say.
No, absolutely. But speaking of people who will someday show up at the Riyadh Comedy Festival, Brian, let's plug some of your pluggables because those are absolutely things we're going to have to share with the Saudi government when we get our spot in the next Riyadh Comedy Festival. So go ahead.
So, first of all, please follow us at the Facebook page Millennials Are Old. That's 3 words, Millennials Are Old. You can also follow us on Instagram and Threads. That's Instagram and Threads. Millennials Are Old Pod, all one word. Millennials Are Old Pod. Still the most efficient and effective way to reach out to me or the show if you want to harass us us, if you want to bully us. If you were a talking head on the I Love the 80s and you would like to come on the show and say, actually, you gave really profound critical analysis, I'm open to that. You can also follow me privately at JLo Biafra, again, all one word, JLo Biafra, on Instagram and Threads. That's a portmanteau of Jennifer Lopez and Jello Biafra, which in itself is a very, in retrospect, a very millennial online handle. Very much like a cringe pun. So, all comes full circle. I'm taking a little bit from the 80s, a little bit from the 90s, and I'm making it all very embarrassing.
Hey, if it makes you feel any better, my private Spotify channel is Mark Juggalo. So you know what, Brian? We've all been there.
The non-joke pun was such a good way to come up with a handle at the time.
It was. There's so many fucking good ones.
Where's Ralph Waldo Emerson? Uncanny Valley Girl.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, it's just, that was the way to fucking be just epic back then. But Brian, speaking of things to be epic about, I am epically excited to go to bed because I love my bed because I'm tired as shit and I want to go to sleep. How about you, Brian?
Actually, so even though this episode is done and we're probably not going to do another I Love series for a while, I'm just in the middle of watching a lot of VH1 I Love content, and it's, even though I just talked some shit about it and I don't think it's a good way to gain information, it's been fun for me to revisit as someone who watched these as a child 23 years ago or whatever. So I'm going to continue watching more I Love the 80s. Just going to watch it on a loop. It's some pleasant background noise while I'm getting ready to fall asleep.
Absolutely. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight. And we're going to come back with a great episode for you next time, as always.